Alright, welcome to the introduction to the animal kingdom. Alright, so we got some good stuff with this group. It's a pretty big group as far as for these two sets of notes, but I have lots of funny stories. I got lots of pictures with it, so the notes or the PowerPoints look long, but with all the pictures and stuff, it's not quite as bad as it seems. But we'll try to get through it. I'll cut down what we need to make sure you get to what you need to know. First of all, you got to know that all animals are heterotrophic, multicellular. They have movement at some point in time in their life cycle, and they're all eukaryotic. So they're all going to have nucleus, membrane-bound organelles, all that good stuff. At some point in time in their life cycle, it might be very, very early on, but at some point in time, they have movement within their life cycle. They're all multicellular, and they're all heterotrophic. All right, and we got a couple terms we need to identify. The first one is zygote. Zygote is the first cell that's produced. So right when a sperm and an egg fuse together, that very first cell of that new organism is called a zygote. Right, so that's the very first one, and it starts dividing into 2 cells and then 4 cells, so on and so forth, and creating an embryo. So an embryo is that group of cells after the zygote. And when animals are an embryo, they go through several different stages. And one of the first stages is known as a blastula stage, and this is when they're a giant ball of cells. So think of it as like a big balloon. They're just a hollow ball of cells. And then the first thing that kind of happens is they go through what's called the gastrula stage, which is where it kind of folds in on itself. So imagine you were taking a balloon and you pushed your finger to the balloon and pushing into the balloon, creating like this cup shape. Right? That's the gastrula stage, is creating that cup shape. And what it does is it creates 3 layers. It creates the inside layer, the part of the balloon that you're touching. It creates the outside layer, the part of the balloon that you're holding. And then it creates that space in between, which is the air inside the balloon. And it also creates at the top of the cup, the rim of the cup ends up developing into a certain structure. And all of these things help to identify some of the characteristics of how organisms have evolved and developed over time. So it's important to know what the gastrula stage is and how it kind of develops, so that when we talk about it later, you'll understand when we start talking about the endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm, and all that good stuff. Okay, so the blastula stage is a big ball of cells like a big balloon. Gastrula stage is when it starts folding in on itself, create this cup shape. And that cup shape, the rim of that cup, depending on what it becomes, helps to identify some of the organisms. And then also, it helps to create those 3 initial layers. Those 3 layers are the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. Ecto meaning outside, so that's the outside layer. Meso meaning middle, and endo meaning inside. So each of those are the layers of the outside layers, the outside of the cup, the part you'd be holding. The mesoderm is the middle part, and the inside, basically the stuff what the cup's made out of. And the endoderm is the very inside part of the cup, the part where a liquid would be kind of like held inside of a cup. All right, so that creates those 3 layers, and each of those 3 layers ends up evolving or ends up developing into a particular organ or organ system. So the ectoderm becomes a nervous system in the skin, because it's on the outside. The mesoderm becomes your muscles, circulatory system, skeletal system. Your endoderm becomes your intestines, the lining of your gut, your respiratory tract, your liver, your pancreas, all that kind of stuff. All right, so think of ecto outside, your skin and your nervous system. Meso, middle, it's got your muscles, your bones, your circulatory system. And then endoderm is the very inside, the lining of your gut, your respiratory tract, your liver, your pancreas, all that good stuff. Now, there are some animals that have no embryonic stages, and these are our 3 phylums that fall into this category. So these guys are actually so primitive that they don't have the endoderm, ectoderm, or mesoderm, and they don't have the gastrula and blastula stage. These guys, sponges, actually don't have any kinds of tissues, and cnidarians and ctenophorans just have endoderm and ectoderm. They don't have any mesoderm. So these are the most primitive of all the animals, and we'll talk about these groups a little bit more in just a moment. Also within, as far as classifying them we go, we have the term coelom. Right? Coelom, C-O-E-L-O-M, is a body cavity. So we can have the term acoelomate, pseudocoelomate, and eucoelomate. Acoelomate means without a body cavity. Anytime you put A in front of a word, it means the opposite of. Right? So acoelomates are organisms that have no body cavity. There's one phylum that falls into that group known as Platyhelminthes. Then there's a group called pseudocoelomates, and they kind of have a false body cavity. Body cavity is where you have all the organs are kind of packaged up nice and neatly. It's separated out. You got a space in between. You got a liquid in there. Everything's flowing around, but everything's packaged nice and neatly inside your internal organs. And so a pseudocoelomate doesn't have everything quite packaged up right. It's got some lining here. It's got some lining there, but not everything is completely packaged up. But it's getting there, and much better than the acoelomate that doesn't have any of that. Everything's just kind of a big jelly mass inside of them. But the pseudocoelomate's still not quite completely there. So they are called pseudocoelomates, and they have a fake body cavity. And they're known as the nematodes. Then our last group are eucoelomates, and eucoelomates are all the organisms that have a true body cavity, and that's all the other groups. So all the most more advanced of our invertebrates. But within that eucoelomate group, we break it down one more time into protostomes and deuterostomes, and this has to do with that cup shape. So that cup shape, the top of the rim of that cup, what that rim of that cup ends up developing into determines whether an organism is in a category of protostome or deuterostome. Protostome, proto means first, stome means mouth, so that means the mouth is the first thing formed. So at the top of the cup, the rim of the cup ends up becoming the mouth, then they're known as the protostomes. That's the mollusks, the annelids, and the arthropods. Deutero means second, stome means mouth, so that means the mouth is actually formed second. So that means the rim of the cup doesn't become the mouth, it actually becomes the anus. So this includes the echinoderms and the chordates. So as you were developing inside of the womb of your mother, the very first thing formed on your body was your anus. Yes, yes. So we are classified in this category of deuterostomes, and those are actually the most advanced out of all organisms. Right, and then the last way we kind of help classify organisms is based on their symmetry. And so how many ways you can cut them in half and get two equal sides. So we do have an organism, a group called that are asymmetrical. Those are our sponges, also known as porifera. And they have an asymmetry. They grow kind of like trees. They got a branch here, a branch there, but there's no real complete symmetry to them. They can grow kind of willy-nilly any way that they want. So they have irregular shapes, and so they're put into the asymmetrical category. Then we have radial symmetry. Think of radial tire or radius. It's going to be things that are round. So they can divide into equal halves using many different planes. So think of like a pizza or a pie, and you can cut those in a whole bunch of different ways and get two equal halves. So these are going to be all the ones that look round looking down from the top. So these are going to be all your cnidarians like your jellyfish, and then also your echinoderms like your sea stars. And the last type of symmetry is bilateral symmetry, and this is what we have. And you can only be divided into left and right hemispheres, all right, left and right halves. And it's by far the most efficient for movement. It includes your flatworms, platyhelminthes, your roundworms, your nematodes, your mollusks, your segmented worms, your annelids, your chordates, all those other groups. So it's, bilateral symmetry is very, very common in your more advanced organisms because it allows for the most efficient movement. And lastly, you need to know some anatomical positions. So you get the anterior means towards your head, dorsal means towards your back, posterior means towards your tail, and ventral means towards your belly. All right, so make sure you know those four different anatomical positions. The anterior is towards the head, dorsal back, posterior tail, and ventral is belly. All right, so now we're going to go through our different invertebrate phylums. So we're taking basically, over the next two sets of notes, we're taking the animal kingdom, and we're going through every single phylum within the group. All right, and we're going to go into depth a little for each one. And then our next set of notes is going to be specifically on vertebrates, so on our chordates. So we're going to go through all the invertebrates today and in this lecture, and then our next lecture we're going to go through all the vertebrates and go more in depth just into that one phylum. Now, first phylum is our sponges. All right, so we got our sponge category. The actual phylum name is Porifera, Porifera. So make sure you add that in there. All right, that it's the actual phylum name is on Porifera, and it's on your assignment that you have for today. And these are, like we said before, are asymmetrical. You can have freshwater or saltwater ones, although the large majority are saltwater. And they are what are known as sessile. They're sedentary. They do not move once they land. So as when they're little larvae swimming around, but then as soon as they land, they stay there for the rest of their lives. They have structures inside of them called spicules, which are kind of like little glass shards inside of them. And this provides them with some support. So their tissues or their cells grow around these little glass shards, these little spicules, and it helps provide them with support. It also makes them kind of not tasty for a lot of organisms. It kind of provides the skeleton, even though they don't have a skeleton, it kind of provides the support structure for their bodies. And sponges are filter feeders. They pull in water through the sides and push it out through the top, and as it travels through their tissue or their cells, the cells grab all the good stuff out of it, and then the water leaves out the top of the sponge. There's a nice little picture of one. Very simple, very basic organisms. They can barely be classified as multicellular. The cells are working together, but they don't even really have true tissues yet. They're very, very basic organisms, very basic animals. They can reproduce both asexually and sexually. If you knock one over, each of the new pieces can actually become a sponge on its own. It can do something called budding, which is kind of like where they grow a little mini-me off their hip, and then it jumps off and runs away when it gets big enough. And then they can also reproduce sexually with external or internal fertilization. Basically, most of the time for these guys, they just release a whole bunch of sperm and egg into the water and hope everything goes well. So enjoy swimming in that ocean. Our next phylum, so this is our next group. So we had our peripheral were our sponges. This is our next phylum down is our cnidarians. And this is going to include all the groups that include stinging animals that have stinging cells. Right? So they're going to have be all your corals, your jellyfish, your sea anemones, your hydras, things along those lines. Now with this group, at the end of these set of notes, I'm going to add in one more class that you need to know. It's on your assignment, but I'm going to add in that's not on this notes. So you need to pay attention to listen. So radial symmetry, all these have radial symmetry. You can cut in multiple different ways, and almost all of them are saltwater. There's very few freshwater ones. The hydra is, but they're microscopic, and there's not a whole lot of them. Sea anemone included in this group. So as far as movement goes, if they're a polyp, they're sessile, and if they're medusa, they're modal. So what does a polyp mean? Polyp means their tentacles are facing up. Medusa means their tentacles are facing down. Please make sure you know that. I'm going to ask that. All right. So polyp, tentacles facing up. Medusa, tentacles facing down. And so if they're polyp, tentacles facing up, they're sessile, means they kind of hang out. They don't really move around a whole lot. They can kind of slide a little bit, but they pretty much stay in their general location once they land there. They swim around as a larva, land, and then they stay. Medusa is our jellyfish, tentacles facing down. So they're able to swim around, move around, and be very, very active. And then with these guys, those stinging cells are known as nematocysts. Highlight, underline, circle, square, everything about this, right? Nematocysts are going to be one of the key things about this group. I'm going to ask you about it, I promise. All right, so nematocysts are basically these special cells in their bodies that have little hair triggers on the outside of them. And when something brushes up and triggers that hair trigger, it causes it to shoot out a harpoon. And attached to that harpoon is a long tube, and attached to the end of that tube is a giant sac of venom. And so that tiny little microscopic harpoon shoots into whatever's brushed up against it, and then the venom sac squeezes and injects the venom in through that harpoon. So not only is it shooting a harpoon and locking on to whatever brushed against it, but then it's injecting venom in at the same time. So these are our nematocysts, and your jellyfish and the sea anemones have thousands upon thousands of them all over the place, all right, on their tentacles and all over to help grab food and for protection. Now, think about it a little bit. So as far as fish swimming through, if you ever watched Finding Nemo, you saw Dory actually was kind of getting pulled up into the jellyfish, right? That's because those harpoons start shooting into her skin, and it literally locks on her. Those harpoons grab and lock her into those tentacles so that she can't get away. And then they inject their venom. And then as she struggles, she would move around, bump into more tentacles, and get even more harpoons shot in and even more venom put inside their body. So it's a very effective method for getting food. The problem is if you bump into a jellyfish, what happens? The same exact thing. So let's say your arm brushes up against a jellyfish. All those little nematocysts fire into your arm. You get tons and tons of harpoons shot into your skin and lots of venom injected into your skin. What's your first reaction? You scream, go, ow, pull your arm back. You are a lot bigger than a jellyfish. So as you pull your arm away and run back to the beach, you have literally ripped the tentacles off of that jellyfish, and they are now stuck onto your arm. You know, what's most people's first reaction is to start rubbing the part that got burnt. Unfortunately, as you do that, you start rubbing the tentacles all over your arm, and all the other nematocysts that hadn't fired yet are now going to fire. And so you can make that sting much, much, much worse if you start touching it or messing with it. What you need to do is put something on it that will neutralize the rest of the nematocysts. And this is where people talk about peeing on it on the beach. Or you can do like I do, and I just go grab $1 bottle of ammonia from Walmart and keep it in my trunk whenever I go to the beach. So what you can do is you take that ammonia, you pour it on top of wherever the sting is from the jellyfish, and what it does is it immobilizes and kills off basically all the rest of the nematocyst cells that might be in the tentacles that are on your arm. It's not going to help any of the sting that you've already had, but it will keep you from getting stung worse. All right, so this is why you do that. So this is why you've heard of people peeing on a jellyfish sting. It doesn't actually help the sting. What it does is it prevents you from getting stung worse by killing off the rest of the nematocyst cells that might be on your skin. And that probably are, since you got stung by the tentacle, and that tentacle is probably still on your skin. These cnidarians can reproduce asexually, again, by budding. So same kind of idea. They grow a little mini-me, pops off, runs away. Or sexually by releasing sperm and egg into the water. All right, our next group, or our first group that we'll talk about, so this is our class. All right, so we got our phylum is Cnidarium, so that's our big group. And then under that, we're going to talk about 4 classes. All right, so you need to make sure, so this is kind of still underneath of our Cnidarians. All right, so our first class that we're going to talk about are the hydrozoans. A lot of these guys are colonial. They like to hang out, and the 2 examples are the hydras and the man-o'-war. Hydra is our freshwater example. It's teeny tiny, microscopic. It's a cute little guy. Looks like a miniature sea anemone. And then the man-o'-war is something completely different. This is a man-o'-war. All right, so it's got this giant bell, and off this bell, the bell is basically a giant balloon that one of those little hydrozoans has blown up, and then all the other little hydrozoans have attached onto it. So you see all those tentacles hanging down. Each one of those tentacles is a different hydrozoan. So think of it as like an apartment complex of these hydrozoans all hanging out together. That's why they're colonial. All right, so one of them creates this big balloon up top that helps them float at the surface, and then each one drops down a tentacle down, and these things can get enormous. All right, that bell can be over 3 feet across, and those tentacles can be over 100 feet long. They don't sting super bad. They sting pretty bad, but they're not like super deadly. But when you run into 100 feet of tentacles, you can have a serious problem. So they have actually killed people by who have gotten tangled up in the middle of them and gotten 100 feet of tentacles wrapped around them. It's kind of like getting stung by 10,000 bees. All right, so it is possible to die from them, but the thing is they just get so big that you can be playing on a beach and that bell could be 100 feet away that you don't even see it, and you can still get stung really badly by them. So these are an interesting and something that people look out for a lot. Our next category is our scyphozoans. So this is our next class, all right, still under our Cnidarians. All right, scyphozoans are our typical jellyfish. So whenever you think of a jellyfish, you think of scyphozoans. All right, the Medusa form is dominant. That means the tentacles are facing down. All right, they swim around feeding on plankton and small fish. And here's a cool picture of one. This is called a lion's mane jellyfish. You should Google it if you get a chance. Lion's mane jellyfish are enormous. They can get like 4 or 5 feet across in that bell, so they get huge. There's some cool pictures of scuba divers swimming next to them, and it's almost as big as a scuba diver. These guys live in the deep, dark ocean, thousands of feet down, and then once they are ready to reproduce, what they do is they come up in the shallows and they wash up on shore. And as they wash up on shore, they run into the rocks and the waves and crashing, and it starts shredding up their tissues. And that actually instigates them to release their sperm and the egg. So they can't actually reproduce until they die. And so several of them will wash up on shore, shreds them all up. They all release sperm and egg. You get some babies. Those babies make it all the way down to the deep again. They grow back up. And then when they become mature, and you get the whole life cycle going. Well, Japan, these guys are really found in the deep trenches off of in the Pacific, and so Japan was having a real problem when they were when they started deep sea trawling, and so they started dropping down these giant nets off the coast of Japan in some of the really deep trenches, and they were pulling up hundreds and hundreds of these. You know, if you Google lion's mane jellyfish and ships, you'll see a picture of basically this giant net completely filled with hundreds of these guys. And what do you think those nets did to these giant lion's mane jellyfish? That's right, they shredded them to pieces. And what happened? Those hundreds and hundreds and thousands of lion's mane jellyfish all put out sperm and egg at the same exact time. And all those little babies floated down to the deep ocean and came back. And so what happened is once they started doing the deep sea trawling, it was about 5 or 10 years later, and then all of a sudden they had this huge influx of adult lion's mane jellyfish on the shorelines. There were so many of them, they actually plugged up several of the harbors along Japan, so much that it looked like you could walk across the bay. They could not get boats in and out of the harbor because there were so many of millions of these guys had all grown up and washed up ashore altogether. And so it caused a real problem. So now they've been really working on how to collect the fish that they want with the nets that they want without actually disturbing all these jellyfish. It's a pretty funny story. Next class is our anthozoans. Our anthozoans lack a medusa stage, so they're only in the polyp form. Only the tentacles are facing up. And many of these, almost all of them, have a symbiotic relationship with dinoflagellates. Please remember that, okay? This includes our corals and sea anemones. So our dinoflagellates with our corals and our sea anemones work together, and the dinoflagellates photosynthesize and get all the energy and nutrients and produce a lot of extra stuff for the corals and the sea anemones, and the sea anemones and corals provide them a safe place to live where they get lots of sunlight. This is why corals and sea anemones need to grow in clear water, warm water, all that kind of good stuff to provide a nice, healthy place for those dinoflagellates to do their thing. Corals and sea anemones typically cannot survive without those dinoflagellates. Right? Dinoflagellates can survive out in the water by themselves, but they do much better in corals and sea anemones. But the corals and sea anemones cannot live without those dinoflagellates. Most of the time, they end up dying if they lose that symbiotic relationship. There's a coral. And then this is where I was talking about. So we're going to add in one more group. So after our anthozoans, we're going to add in a group called cubozoans. Right? It's Cubazoans. And the cubozoans are our box jellyfish. Right? So our box jellyfish are our cubozoans. And these box jellyfish are the most advanced out of all the jellyfish. They actually have eyes that can see really well. They have lenses. And they are attracted to movement, splashing in the water, and they can swim as fast as an Olympic swimmer. All right, they're known as our box jellyfish, and the common box jellyfish can get almost 6 feet long. They're common around the waters of Australia and out in the Pacific that way, and they're a big issue. If you ever go to Australia, you'll see all these nets around, and you'll think, oh, it's to keep the sharks out. Nope, it's to keep these jellyfish out. These jellyfish are extremely toxic. If you get wrapped up in a whole bunch of those tentacles, you can die. And so the box jellyfish being attracted to splashing makes it also a big problem. So anytime people get in the ocean, you got to be very careful. So that's why they put up a whole bunch of nets around in Sydney and other places, and so that you don't have to worry about the box jellyfish. Now, in this category is also something called an irukandji. An irukandji is a type of cubozoan, but it's teeny tiny. It's about the size of a quarter or even a little bit smaller. And it's completely clear, so it's really hard to see. And it's found in certain more rural areas in Australia, and it is the most toxic jellyfish on the planet. There's a really cool National Geographic that was dealing with him, where there's this guy and this girl professors that were studying the irukandji and all the things and how it worked and where it reproduced, and so they could learn more about it because it was killing people. And so they put on this special wetsuit and they put on a special mask and basically had their entire bodies almost completely covered. So then they went out in the nighttime with a flashlight looking for these guys to collect them to try to get samples. And so they're out there, and National Geographic guys are have the cameras out, and they're watching them, follow them, and they find one, and they show it, and they collect it, put it in a bottle, and then they go out and try to looking for some more. And all of a sudden you hear the guy scream. And he swims back to the boat real quick, and one of the irukandji had run into, and it brushed right against the top of his lip. Right in like the only place that any skin was exposed at all, right at the top of his lip, it brushed across his lip. And so they pull him into the boat. They start taking off all their gear. The lady scientist comes swimming, gets in the boat. She starts taking off all of her gear. What she didn't realize is on the outside, stuck on the outside of her wetsuit, was an irukandji. And so as she was taking off her wetsuit, she bumped into one also and got stung too. And so they end up, the whole rest of the show is then racing back to the hospital, taking these guys to the hospital, and the whole rest of the show is showing them going through the processes and all the issues that come along with getting stung by an irukandji. They had to put him on, I think the guy got a really bad sting. I think they had to put him on a ventilator. At one point in time, they had to medically induce a coma because he was in so much pain, it was literally driving him insane. And they were like this for weeks. And so it was, I think he almost died like 2 or 3 times. And so, and this is all from it brushing right up against the top of his lip. Crazy, super powerful toxin that these guys have, and so they're still learning about them. And they're so teeny tiny. There's pretty much nothing can be done other than you stay away from the couple of areas that they know where they're found and where they kind of hang out. But that's our cubozoans. And so we're going to have a running theme here, so I need you to listen up. So our running theme is, where does the most toxic or most venomous or the most deadly of any organism live? Well, for our cnidarians, for all our stinging cell organisms, the most deadly of all our stinging cell organisms is the irukandji. And where does it live? Australia. Keep that in mind. All right, our next phylum. So this is a whole other group. So not in stinging cells anymore. So we had our peripheral was our sponges. We had our cnidarians, which is our jellyfish and stuff like that. And now we have our ctenophorans. Ctenophorans are known as comb jellies. They look like jellyfish, but they're completely harmless. They have no nematocysts. They simply swim around in the water, and they have a mucus layer on the outside, and they trap basically little bacteria and plankton and things like that inside their mucus and eat that. So they're completely harmless, and they're actually quite pretty. You can see a picture of one right here. So they're clear. They have these little cilia on the outside that wave and kind of push them through the water. When the light hits it, it refracts and looks kind of like a rainbow. If you go to Virginia Beach and basically scoop a net through the water and dump it into a glass jar, you can see these guys. They're all over the place. You never would know it, but they're constantly swimming around you pretty much in every beach that you go to. It's pretty cool. And that's all for that group. Our next phylum are known as Platyhelminthes, and this is a very important group. I'm going to ask you about this group quite a bit, especially about the fact that line down at the bottom is the first appearance of cephalization. Please make sure you know this. I have a problem with people remembering this one. It will be on your quiz and on your test. But Platyhelminthes is our first group to develop bilateral symmetry. All right, these are our flatworms. Right? And they're also the first group to develop all three layers. They're the first group to have endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. They're the first group to have bilateral symmetry. So they're a very, very important group. Right? It's a big evolutionary step here, moving from our radial symmetry organisms like our jellyfish to these flatworms. All right? So a big evolutionary step, so you need to make sure you remember them. The first ones have bilateral symmetry. When you have bilateral symmetry, what it means is that you have a left and right side. It also means that you have a front and you have a back. And it allows you to focus and moving in one direction. So this is when things develop a tail and things like that. And so since you're always moving in one direction, you want to put all your sense organs in the front so that you can see everything coming. So you put your eyes at the front, you put your nose at the front, you put your mouth at the front, you put everything that senses, all the smells, everything, all your sensory organs up towards the front where you can see everything coming. Okay? Where you can sense and see everything that's coming along. And what it does, by having all those organs in one area, you start having a lot of nervous tissue, and you develop something called cephalization, which means the creation of a head. All right, so you develop this head structure that has all these sense organs on it. With all those different neurons and sense organs, you need something to help control them, and so you start developing ganglion and developing a brain. All right, so this whole idea of bilateral symmetry led to this idea of cephalization, and which eventually led to having a brain. So these guys are extremely important because without this evolutionary advancement, we would never exist. We wouldn't have brains. We wouldn't have heads. That head region is a very big step. So you need to know that Platyhelminthes were the first ones to develop bilateral symmetry, and this led to cephalization, or the creating of a head. All right, there's your warning. These are also acoelomates, so they have no body cavity. They're basically, their internal organs are all kind of jelly, kind of floating around inside a jelly. There is no tissues kind of separating them out. And this is a cute little picture of one called a planarian. These guys are used in some scientific research and stuff, but this is pretty much the only cute version. All right, the rest of them are all things like tapeworms. And so the bottom line there is the one that you need to know, proglottids. Please highlight and underline that. You must know proglottids. All right, proglottids is the group, is basically the reproductive structure of your the tapeworms. And so basically the tapeworm is the tiny little dark red part at the top of there, and that is the body of the tapeworm. And everything after that are proglottids, are these egg sacs. Right? And so the youngest egg sacs, the most immature egg sacs, are the ones right after the body, and then as they move down, they get pushed down further and further, they get more and more mature to the end. And then once they mature and are ready, they'll pop off the end and go and do what they do. And so these little egg sacs, or these proglottids, are packed full of sperm and egg, and they can actually crawl and move completely on their own. So when they break off, they're actually able to crawl around, and a lot of times they will actually crawl out because they're found in your intestines, and so they'll crawl out of the intestines, out of the anus. They will have a tendency to crawl up and around and onto the backs of whatever organisms they're crawling out of. And then they dry out, and as they dry, they get this sticky substance on the outside that embeds them into the hair, and they dry out and become very, very brittle. And so when something bumps up against them, they crack open, releasing all the sperm in the egg, fertilizing, and producing and putting all these new little zygotes of this worm onto whatever bumped into them. So the example is if your dog has tapeworms, one crawls out at night, crawls up on its back, and dries out. Your dog comes and greets you in the morning. You pet your dog, and you break open that egg sac, covering your hands with tiny little tapeworms. You didn't wash your hands before you started having your piece of toast for breakfast, and now you have lots of tapeworms inside your belly. All right? This is why you always wash your hands after you pet your animals. If your animals have fleas, then they probably have tapeworms, right? Fleas and tapeworms, fleas are part of their whole reproductive life cycle. So if they have fleas, they're going to bite the fleas, they're going to eat the fleas, they're going to get tapeworms from the fleas, and so therefore they're able to pass those along to you. So make sure that you always wash your hands after you pet your dog or your cat. Roundworms is our next phylum. So we had our Platyhelminthes, or our flatworms, and that had our first ones have bilateral symmetry and our cephalization. Next group are our roundworms, also known as Nematoda. All right, so the phylum Nematoda, and these guys are also bilateral symmetrical, but these have developed a pseudocoelomate, so they have a false body cavity. They're kind of the next evolutionary step up. They have some muscles and all that kind of good stuff, and help move around. Right? And a very important group as far as parasitic infections and causing pests and problems for the world. This group includes a whole bunch of different agricultural pests that kill all kinds of plants, things along those lines, and also a big pest as far as livestock and people. Pinworms, scarids, hookworms, and trichinella are just some of the examples of this group, and I'd like you to kind of know some of these guys. Pinworms is one of the most common human infection of roundworms that there is. There are tiny little worms. If you've ever given your dog a dewormer, like if you've got a puppy and they've say that your puppy has been dewormed, this is the main worm that they're going after. It's the little pinworms. They're teeny tiny little guys, and they like to crawl out at nighttime, get some air, and then crawl back in. And so as doing this process, they tend to cause irritation around the anus. So if your dog has ever kind of dragged its ass across the carpet doing ass races, that's a lot of times a signal that they might have pinworms. So you need to be careful. And what do dogs tend to do when they have an irritated butt? But they lick it. And then they lick it and they get the pinworms all in their mouth. And then you go, oh, I love my doggy. And it kisses you in the face and wipes all those pinworms around your face and in your mouth. And you get pinworms. And it's a very, very nasty thing to have. All right? These are pretty gross and disgusting. So don't ever let your animals lick you in the face. All right? I'm trying to help you out here. All right? So pinworms are gross. And if you ever want to know if you have pinworms, if you're having some irritation down there and you're not quite sure, you can always take a piece of Scotch tape, put it over top of your anus, go to sleep. When you wake up in the morning, pull it off. If you have pinworms, they'll be stuck to the tape. Nice self-test for you. All right. Anyways, then we move on to our scarids. Scarids is a very large group of nematodes. These guys are often parasites of intestinal parasites that are a lot bigger than our pinworms. They can get huge, and they can become a real problem for organisms. There's some pictures if you Google scarids. There's some pictures of basically some intestines that they've cut open that are basically just packed full, look like giant worms. They look like giant pieces of spaghetti, packed the entire intestines of some of the animals that they infect. So they can lead to death if they become that bad. So they're a big problem. You also have hookworms, which are a worm that burrow in through the bottom of your feet. So if you're walking around barefoot, not a big problem here in the United States, except sometimes down in Florida occasionally they have an issue. But otherwise, most of the time it's places like India, Africa, things like that, where you get these hookworms and people walking around barefoot. And these hookworms burrow up through the bottom of their feet, and then they start living underneath your skin and inside your blood, depending on the type of hookworm. And they can get huge. These are the ones, if you've ever seen pictures of like where they've made a little cut and start pulling the worm out of somebody's underneath somebody's skin or out of somebody's blood vessel. These are the worms that they're doing that with most of the time. Really nasty type of worm, also known as a guinea worm, is in this group. All right. You also have heartworms are in this category of nematodes. All right, so they're a big issue too. And the last example I want you to know is trichinella. Trichinella is the reason why we cook pork all the way through. Trichinella is a worm that embeds itself inside of muscle tissue and forms a cyst. And these cysts end up weakening the muscle, and if they start forming these cysts inside of your heart tissue, they can kill you. This is why we cook pork all the way through. So you don't ever want to eat pork that is uncooked. The United States, again, typically not an issue. It's not that big a deal, but if you ever travel outside the United States, especially like in the Caribbean, South America, places like that, trichinella can be pretty common. And so you always want to make sure that your pork is cooked all the way through. Otherwise, you can get these guys, and they can cause some serious complications. And then there are also lots of them that infect insects that will live inside of an insect and literally eat their way out. If you have the stomach for it, you can YouTube the video that says worm crawls out of a spider. Okay, and so basically they had this spider that they sprayed with a bug killer, and then the spider died, but then this giant worm literally crawled out from inside of the spider. It was basically almost the entire size of the spider, and had basically almost eaten the spider from inside out completely. Pretty disgusting, but pretty awesome to watch. All right, next phylum, annelids. Annelids are known as our segmented worms. All right, so this is our next big group. This is our step up from our nematodes. So we had our platyhelminthes as our flatworms, our most basic of our worms, but still a big step up from our cnidarians. Then we have our nematodes, which are a step up from our platyhelminthes, and now our annelids, which are a step up from our nematodes. So these are segmented bodies. These are the most complex of worms. They have all kinds of specialized muscle. They're hermaphrodites. They can reproduce. They have both male and female parts. And so this is our biggest group. They have a special structure called a setae, which are little hairs on the outside of them to help them move through the soil. Think of your earthworms when you think of annelids. All right, earthworms have these little hairs. This is why if you actually take an earthworm, if you get a chance, run your fingers from head to tail. They're all smooth and slimy. But if you run your fingers from their tail to their head, they're really rough. And that's all the little hairs. They're all facing backwards to help pull them through the soil and help them crawl around. And so annelids are hermaphrodites. And one thing about hermaphrodites, a lot of these worms is they play a wonderful game of tag you're pregnant. Basically, it costs a lot of energy to get pregnant, but doesn't cost a lot of energy to pregnate something else. And so since they're hermaphrodites, they have both male and female parts. And so what they do is they try to impregnate another worm without getting pregnant themselves, because it costs a lot of energy. And so they'll play a wonderful game of tag you're pregnant with another worm, trying to impregnate that other worm without getting impregnated at the same time. Fun. Polychaetes are in this group. You can see the little hairs, the little setae around the edges with the little pseudopodia. These guys are, polychaetes are a lot of times found down in soils and sediments at the bottom of oceans or estuaries. They help break down dead and decaying material. They're detritivores. And then we got a pretty one in this group called Christmas tree worms. So they actually add some color to the corals. All right, my favorite category, my favorite phylum are the mollusks. All right, so we're going to go through these guys. There's lots of cool stuff to talk about with these guys in lots of very different groups. The reason why I like mollusks so much is because there's the different classes within them. They are completely different from each other. They look completely different. Lots of different specialization. Really cool groups. All right, so some key characteristics is these guys are our first. Or these guys have a true coelom. So our annelids were our first eucoelomates. These guys also have a true coelom, so everything's all packaged nice and neat. They have a true circulatory system with a heart and blood vessels, and they have something called a radula. A radula is often present in most of these guys, and it's basically think of it like a rough tongue. Now, it can be rough to different degrees. If you're talking about a snail, it can be like a cat's tongue almost, where it scrapes away, like a Brillo pad, scraping away the algae off of rocks and aquariums and all kinds of different things like that. But if you're talking about the radula inside of a squid, it literally has little razor blades on it. They use it to rip apart flesh and tear and rasp it into pieces that it can swallow. So our first class within our mollusks are our gastropods, right? Gastro meaning stomach, pod meaning foot. So these are our stomach feet. These are all the things that crawl around on their stomach in this group, like our snails, our limpets, and our slugs. Right? You have freshwater, marine, and terrestrial of all of these guys. They display something called torsion, which is how they kind of move and slime across the ground. And so we have economic importance that a lot of these guys are garden pests. So snails, especially land snails, can be big garden pests. One of the ways that you get rid of them is you can put out a little tin full of beer. They're very attracted to beer, but the alcohol in the beer kills them. And so if you ever have snails as a problem, you can just set out a little tin that has beer in it, and all the little snails that are eating your garden will actually crawl in there and die. We also have escargot, which is in this group, which are lovely, delicious, except that a lot of this group are major intermediate hosts for several very nasty parasitic infections. So the snails that are actually escargot that you buy in a restaurant are delicious and are perfectly fine. But other snails are not. If you ever watch 1,000 Ways to Die, there's a great episode where this guy was trying to impress a girl that he asked out on a date. And so he went into his garden, collected a whole bunch of snails, fried them up, and served them to her as escargot. They both ate them, and these snails that they had ended up having lots of nasty parasites inside of them. They got the parasites crawled into their brain and killed them both. Alright, so snails are major crawl around on their stomachs. They get into all kinds of feces of different animals, all kinds of different things, and there's lots of animals that eat snails, and so they're a perfect intermediate for different types of parasites. So as the parasites' eggs get pooped out of whatever animal that they had been infecting, the snails crawl across that. The eggs go into the snail. They have basically a parasite inside the snail that typically doesn't affect the snail too much. Some of the parasites have actually learned that they can take control of the snail's brain and make the snail crawl to the tip top of leaves, and so it's more likely to be eaten. But other ones just kind of hang out inside the snail and wait for it to get eaten, because most of the time they will. At some point in time in their life cycle. And so those parasites hang out inside of the snail, and then that snail gets eaten. It gets eaten by a bird, it gets eaten by an animal, it gets eaten by a cow accidentally, and then those parasites end up going inside the stomach of that animal, and then that's when they do havoc. They will infect either the intestines, or they'll crawl into the liver, or they'll crawl into the bloodstream and crawl all over the body and cause all kinds of problems for that particular organism. And so a lot of snails have, and slugs and all that kind of group, have lots of nasty parasitic infections that can infect you and cause all kinds of problems. So only eat escargot if it's coming from a restaurant, a reputable restaurant. Do not eat one if some stupid guy tries to make you something. Alright, so we got a lovely picture of a land snail there on the left. You got your sea slug there on the right, so our marine organism for this group. Alright, and then this is our beautiful cone snail. Cone snails are a marine type of snail. They are a special type of snail because they're a carnivorous snail. These snails will eat fish. You can see that long kind of tube going out the side there. That is the tube that houses their proboscis, or their harpoon that they have. And that harpoon is able to inject a toxin, and they basically sit around and wait for a fish to swim by. They shoot out the harpoon really quickly. The harpoon injects the toxin into the fish, and then the fish dies, and they swallow it and eat it. And you can see its giant mouth there that's kind of open there that it uses to swallow up whatever fish that it is killed. This toxin, the snails are known for not exactly being speedy, so they have to have a toxin that kills the fish very fast, because if the fish swims too far away, the snail will never find it. So this toxin will kill a fish in less than 1/10 of a second, instantaneously pretty much. And so as soon as the harpoon hits, it injects the toxin, and that fish will die in less than a second. And so that allows the snail to be able to consume it. So this means that toxin is extremely aggressive and extremely potent. And it is actually, what happens is we have, these guys like to hang out in tidal pools. And so you have people that go into tidal pools, and they start moving around rocks and start seeing all these pretty shells. And these snails will curl up inside their shell, and you can't really see them inside of their shell. And so people will collect up the shell. It's got nice pretty colors on it. And so they'll think, oh, pretty shell. They'll put it in their pocket, and they'll go home. They'll go back to their hotel room. And since they're visiting in different locations. And so they'll go back to the hotel room, they'll start looking through the shells, or they'll still have it in their pocket. The snail, starting to dry out, gets irritated, and any kind of movement that comes out, it shoots its harpoon. And so it'll shoot the harpoon and stab people through their shorts into the leg, or into their hand as they're holding the shell, and release its toxin, killing the person within, it kills a person within about 30 minutes at the most. And most of the time, people don't realize what's happened. So they might get stung by the cone snail, but they don't realize that it's a deadly snail, because you don't really think of snails as being deadly, and so they don't even go and get help, and they pretty much die in their hotel rooms. So this is a pretty big problem. They actually have all kinds of warning signs by the tidal pools warning about cone snails and how toxic and deadly they can actually be. And so we have the most lethal of all the gastropods, and guess where this guy lives? Australia. Of course he does. All right, our next class underneath this is still a mollusk. Our next class are known as bivalves, and these are all the little things that have two shells. So this is our oysters and our clams and our mussels and our scallops, all kinds of wonderful, delicious things. So often used as food. You have the oysters that produce pearls, and you also have invasive species like the zebra mussel and the razor clam that can move into areas and outcompete native species, and also cause all kinds of problems with their shells and all kinds of issues. You got a scallop down there at the bottom there. You got a clam up at the top. And here's your oyster with your pretty pearl. Interesting fact, almost all pearls today are kind of 99% fake. The only part that's actual real pearl is a very outside coating. What they do is they take these oysters like this one, and they will let them grow up, and then they will take a little set of pliers and pry them open just a little bit. They'll make a little cut, and they'll put in this plug. This plug is a perfectly round piece of, might be mother of pearl, might be some kind of calcium, something like that. They'll put it inside of there. Wait about a year for that oyster to coat that plug with the pearl coating, and then they'll go in, open it up, pull it out, put in another one, and they'll just keep on doing that over and over and over again. So if you bought anything that's pearl, and it wasn't thousands upon thousands of dollars, then it's probably this type of pearl. A real, actual pearl that has gone all the way from a grain of sand all the way up into the full-size pearl is going to be 10 grand or more, at least, if it's a perfectly round pearl. And then when you're talking about those pearl necklaces you people that you see really wealthy people wear, if it is a real pearl necklace, you're talking about $1 million just for that pearl necklace, because finding all those pearls, the same size, the same color, that are completely round, is extremely rare, and so they are very, very expensive. So real pearls are extremely expensive, but you can find pearls now that are just as pretty, that are just have a light coating on the outside, and they're not all pearl all the way through, and but that makes them much, much, much cheaper. And this is a giant clam that can get huge underneath the water, weigh several hundred pounds, and I guess you could consider it the most lethal because if you're dumb enough to put your hand in it, I guess it could trap you underwater and you die. Don't mess with them. Look at them; they're pretty, and they are found in the Pacific, so I guess you could say it's Australia too. All right, next class is our cephalopoda. All right, cephalopoda is my favorite group. These are our headfoots. These are awesome. All right, they're octopi, they're squid, they're nautilus, they're cuttlefish. These are the ones that have tentacles and suckers, move around by jet propulsion, all kinds of cool stuff. All right, so this group is known for being extremely intelligent. They have highly advanced nervous system. All of them have a shell except for the octopi. So the nautilus has a great big shell on the outside. We'll see a picture in a second. Squids have a very small, little thin shell inside their body. Cuttlefish have a cuttle bone, which is kind of a thicker shell, but it's also inside their body. And the octopi are the only ones that are completely absent of their shells. This is a nautilus, so you can see the huge shell on the outside, kind of like armor plating. These things are hundreds of millions of years old. They've been around since before the dinosaurs. They've been around since back with trilobites, and kind of the first ocean organisms have kind of popped up. They are nowadays, these guys are mainly scavengers. They kind of go around collecting any kind of dead and decaying things off the bottom, and eating very small things like little shrimps and stuff. Like I said, the cephalopod nervous system is extremely complex. They have very complex brains, huge eyes for their bodies. Their bodies are covered with chromatophores and allows them to do color changing, to signal, and to communicate. So they have extremely complicated communication systems a lot of times between them. Very cool organisms as far as their adaptability and their intelligence and communication levels. We do research on them for their nervous system. Since the nervous system is so advanced, we can actually use it for some of our research into diseases and different kinds of medications. We use them for bait. Pretty much what I've found is that pretty much everything eats some kind of squid in the ocean. Calamari, you have the loligo squid, which is one of our smaller squids that have tons and tons of fish eat. But even all the way up to the giant squid, you have great whites and sperm whales eat those. So squid pretty much are major food sources for a lot of different organisms in the ocean. They grow very fast, they reproduce very quickly, and so they have become kind of like a favorite snack of many, many different organisms in the ocean. And so we got three examples. Loligo is that common squid that I'm telling you about. If you ever had calamari, this is what you've had, most likely. There's Architeuthis dux, which is our giant squid. Those are the ones that can get huge. I think the biggest example that they've seen so far is washed up is about 40 feet. But at the ends of their tentacles, or at the ends of their arms that they shoot out, the tentacles that they shoot out, they have suckers that have little hooks in them. And those hooks, they have found hooks like that embedded into submarines and then underneath of giant tankers. They've been kind of stuck in the bottom of them, and the hooks were so big that the squid had to be about 100 feet long. So they know out there that at least at one point in time there were 100-foot giant squid out there. But the biggest ones they've seen so far are about 40 feet. And then there's Octopus delphini, which is the giant Pacific octopus. These are kind of cool. They had one in the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where they had it in this really pretty exhibit with all these sharks and other fish swimming around, and people kept coming back, and every time they checked in on it, there were less and less sharks, and they didn't understand what was going on. They never found any bodies. The sharks weren't just dying, so they didn't know exactly what was happening until they stayed overnight and they put a camera in there, and they watched as the octopus came out, grabbed one of the sharks and ate it completely all the way through. And devoured it whole. So it was pretty amazing that these guys are actually shark hunters also. And they can get huge. They can get about 20 to 30 feet across from tentacle to tentacle. So they can get very, very large also. This is your giant squid, your Architeuthis dux. This is a baby version. It's only about 20 feet long, but they get huge, enormous. This is a vampire squid, which are pretty cool. They can are deep sea squid. They can turn themselves in kind of inside out a little bit, where they have all these little prickly looking tentacles underneath. And then this is our blue-ringed octopus. You might notice this from the 007 movie Octopussy. Blue-ringed octopus are extremely toxic. They're actually pretty small. They're typically about smaller than a baseball. They can inject their toxin into the water, so they don't even have to bite something. They can just push out their toxin into the water and immobilize prey that way. But they can also bite and inject their venom. Venom is one of the most potent neurotoxins known to man. It's the same kind of neurotoxin found inside of poison dart frogs. These guys can actually, when they bite, they don't necessarily even leave a mark. They think that they have some way of actually being able to inject it in your skin without actually having to pierce your flesh. They can actually put it up to the skin, and it goes in through the skin, it absorbs in, or something along those lines. Because they found people dead that from this toxin, but don't find any bite marks from them. And these guys are found in tidal pools also, and they're actually found right beside the cone snail. So these are also found in Australia. So our most toxic snail and our most toxic octopus are all found in Australia. This is called a Humboldt squid. These Humboldt squid get about 6 feet long, weigh about 120 pounds, and they grow extremely quickly. You have to realize that a lot of these squid and octopi end up only living for about 2 years. So these squid that get 100 pounds have to get that way in about 12 to 16 months in order to be able to still reproduce. And so these squid have to eat voraciously. And there's been all kinds of National Geographics on them, where you have these people that are hand lining them up. So they basically drop this giant ball of hooks that's big and shiny. The squid will attack it, and they pull them up. Every once in a while, they get tangled up in the ropes and get pulled over. And then you can imagine what happens when you have lots of voracious little squid, big squid, all around needing lots of food. So they grab the person and eat them. And so they've been known for attacking humans in those kind of instances when that happens. Big thing is with all the climate shift and everything, the waters are warming up in the ocean, especially in the Pacific Ocean right now. It's making it so that these guys who normally are in the Baja California are able to move up the coastline. And they've started moving up further and further north. And they've had a problem actually recently in L.A. There have been people swimming in the off of L.A. that have had baby Humboldts about 1 to 2 feet long attacking them in the shore and in the surf. And they're eating a lot of the native species up in that area. So they're slowly moving up the west coast and starting to cause some problems in some of those areas. And this is an octopus in my big club hands. I've been to Hawaii a couple times, and every time I go, I go and I'll catch different things and take pictures of them. This is one of the octopi that I ended up catching out in Hawaii. Chitons are also in this group, but you don't have to know a whole lot about them. All right, phylum Arthropoda. Next to the last one. We got 2 more phylums left to go. So Arthropoda is our jointed leg invertebrates. So these are the ones that have an exoskeleton, and their exoskeleton is made out of chitin. So they have a chitinous exoskeleton, which is that second line there. This is a lot of stuff. You need to know the top 4. Highlight and underline all of the top 4 of these. Okay, make sure you got them, because they will be on your quiz, and they will be on your test. The first line, metamerism with tagmatization. What that means, metamerism means they're in segments. Tagmatization means those segments are specialized. So we had the segments in our segmented worms. Like if you look at an earthworm, you'll see all those little lines in there. Each of those segments are separated out from each other, but they're not specialized. They're all pretty much similar to each other ones. Right? With our arthropods, each of the segments of their bodies are completely different from the other ones. You have the thorax, you have the abdomen, right? All of those different types of segments are completely separated from each other and are specialized for specific functions. So they have metamerism with tagmatization. Their bodies are segmented out, and those segments have specialization. Okay. So chitinous exoskeleton, they have an exoskeleton on the outside that's made out of chitin. This is what gives them their strength and support, and also provides a lot of protection. They have those jointed appendages, and they grow by the process of the exodysis, or molting. Right? So they have that exoskeleton. That exoskeleton is a hard exoskeleton. In order for them to get bigger, they got to get rid of it. So they have to shed, they have to molt, they have to go through exodysis. Right? So make sure you know exodysis is molting or losing of that exoskeleton. This is how we get our lovely and wonderful soft-shell crabs. This group are protostomes. So they're still pretty primitive. And they have, but they do have that increased tagmatization, that specialization of all those segments. Now, terrestrial dominance. This is an important one. Highlight and underline this. This might be a short answer question for you. Okay. So the key is how do they minimize water loss and how they all these invertebrates moved up on the land. This arthropod group is the first land animals to show up. Right? We had plants on land, but we did not have any kind of animals before our arthropod group. Right? Everything had always stayed in the ocean. And so with our arthropods, that exoskeleton was really the key. That exoskeleton provided them with a protection and support. That support helped them move up on the land, so they didn't have to worry about flopping around. They already had a way of moving around with that exoskeleton and a way of dealing with the gravity. But also that exoskeleton helped to basically seal them up. The exoskeleton prevented them from water loss. Basically is completely waterproof, and so that way they didn't dry out either. So they had a really nice transition from water to land by using this exoskeleton. All they had to develop then was a advanced respiratory system so that they didn't need gills anymore, that they could breathe the air, and they needed an excretory system so they didn't lose a whole lot of water through peeing and things like that. So and for their dominance, the three things that helped them move on the land was developing the exoskeleton, by having the advanced respiratory system, and advanced excretory system, so that they didn't lose a lot of water. Exodisis again, highlighting it, make sure you know it. I'm just going over it again. That is that shedding or molting of that exoskeleton. And so they drop that large exoskeleton, and it allows them to grow. They'll swell up with water, and then they'll harden the shell. They'll pack it full of calcium and create the chitin again, and harden that shell on the outside with their new larger size. It allows them to grow into it. But when they're soft, they're very vulnerable. Hence our soft shell crab here. All right, so all of our arthropods, all the insects, all the bugs, all your crustaceans, your crabs, your lobsters, your shrimp, everything has to go through this process. They're all vulnerable at different times in their life. And this process, by molting, also allows them to metamorphosize. Think of a caterpillar going into a butterfly. Right? This is that process. This helps with that process. It allows them to make lots of changes. And so they can go from larvae up to adults by doing this process. It allows them to change and produce different structures. We have four subgroups to this group. Right? Trilobita morpha is an extinct group, but then we have Silicerata, Crustacea, and Eunoramia. And I do want you to kind of know these three, just some basic examples of what they are. And there's a couple of them that are important within these groups. All right. Trilobita morpha, all extinct. If you've ever seen fossils like this, you probably have this is a trilobite. They're related to horseshoe crabs, but they're in a different group. All right. Then we have our Silicerata. Silicerata are our horseshoe crabs, but they're also all of our arachnids, including our spiders, mites, ticks, and scorpions. So they all fall into this group. They're all closely related. So horseshoe crabs and spiders are actually very closely related, even though horseshoe crabs are completely harmless and spiders maybe not so much. They have a two-part body system. They have a cephalothorax with and the abdomen, and they have special feeding structures, which is what groups this group together. Here's our spider. So this is our bird-eating tarantula. These things can get huge. They can weigh up to like a pound. They eat full birds and mammals and lizards and all kinds of stuff, and can get about the size of a dinner plate. Here's our horseshoe crab. These guys are all over the East Coast and all in the oceans. They are extremely primitive. We have fossils of these right beside trilobites, right beside the nautilus from 250, 300, 400 million years ago. So these guys have been around for a very, very long time. Next group, next within our arthropods is our crustaceans. Our crustaceans include all of our shrimps, our lobsters, crayfish. They include brine shrimp. They include our lobsters, like our blue lobster here. They include barnacles. So they include our little barnacles like this little guy. Most people don't think of barnacles as being an arthropod, but it's like, think of it as like a little crab that's stuck onto something. Those little legs are all jointed little legs, just like a crab would have, and then basically sticks those legs out and grabs food particles and filters out food that might be floating by. And then our last group within our arthropods is our Eunoramia. And Eunoramia includes our millipedes, centipedes, and insects. So one thing I want you to know is the difference between millipedes and centipedes. I think is an important thing to do. Millipedes, this is our millipedes. Millipedes are rounded. They're kind of armor-like. They're completely harmless. They can't do anything. They kind of move slowly. They have 2 legs for every segment, so it looks like they have thousands and thousands of legs. Some of them can produce a little bit of a toxin, but that's pretty much the only self-defense they have other than their hard exoskeleton. But you can see that they are slow-moving. They're completely harmless here. They might look icky, but they're completely, they won't hurt you. These guys, on the other hand, centipedes, can be very dangerous. You can see, if you look closely down there at the bottom of that picture, you can see its giant jaws with big black fangs. Right? Those jaws are huge. It has giant venom sacs at the base of its jaws as it bites into something and inject a very, very painful, very nasty toxin into it. This particular species of centipede can get over a foot long and can send you to the hospital if it bites you. And these kinds of millipedes are found all throughout the Pacific and including on Hawaii. And they have some special organs like the Johnson's organ, which helps them hear on their antennae. They have tympanic organs on their legs. They actually hear on their legs. All kinds of crazy stuff. We have the compound eye versus the simple eye. And we have a huge economic impact of arthropods, right? They have a major importance to pretty much just about everything. Crops, seafood, medicine, danger, as far as being poisonous, all kinds of different stuff. So crops, insects are a major crop pest, cause lots of issues with crops. All the insecticides and everything that we're having to use to help with crops, so they're a big, big problem. So they impact our economy greatly when we have these pests and these insects that eat all all the crops we're trying to grow. But we also have lots and lots of arthropods that we like to eat. So you got your shrimps, you got your lobsters, you got your crabs, you got all those groups that provide a lot of food, a lot of good part of our economy. Interesting fact, you should really look at this a little bit closer. Horseshoe crabs, their blood has been used to do something called a lysate test. Basically, they can put it inside of a substance, and it helps to coagulate and to group up and basically cause all the impurities within that substance to clump up. And as it clumps up, it allows them to be filtered out. This is what allows us to have medicines that is pure enough that we can actually inject it into our bodies. Right? So they basically will take a whole bunch of insulin that they produce. They'll put just a drop or two of this blood inside of there, and any impurities within that insulin will get will group up, will clump up, and will be filtered out, making that insulin 99.99% pure, so that it doesn't have any kind of toxins or anything built up in it. Doesn't have anything that your body would react to. It makes it so that it's safe to put inside of your body. So the blood of these guys has been extremely important as far as modern medicine to us, and now we have started creating synthetic versions, but this was a big important thing to have a long time ago, or not that long ago. And last, our wonderful example here is our funnel web spider. All right, so this funnel web spider is looks like kind of like a tarantula there. You can see the giant fangs sticking up as it's rearing up. These guys are extremely aggressive. They've been known to chase people that are running by. They burrow into the ground, creating a funneled web that kind of funnels down into a hole in the ground. And then anything that triggers the web on the outside, they'll come running out after and attack. That includes joggers going by. And they can run about as fast as you can. They can jump pretty well, too. And they are the most toxic spider on the planet. They can inject the most venom and the most toxic venom into their prey and into you if you run by, and they have been known to kill people. So they are definitely one of the most aggressive spiders, and definitely one of the most toxic and the most deadly spider on the planet. And guess where they live? That's right, people. They live in Australia. So who wants to go visit? Right, now, last phylum is Echinodermata. Right, Echinodermata. Echino means spiny. Dermata means skin. So Echinodermata are all marine. They're all triploblastic. They have all their endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm, and these are the most advanced out of all of our invertebrates, even though they might not look like it. As adults, they have pentagonal symmetry, but as larvae, they're bilateral. So they do have bilateral symmetry as larvae. They are able to swim around and move around. But then as adults, they kind of revert back to a much more primitive state where they have pentagonal symmetry, a type of radial symmetry. They use hydraulics within their body. They actually don't have blood for most of them. Most of the time, they just use seawater to help carry around the nutrients and the oxygen within their body. And they also use that seawater to create hydraulics to allow them to be actually very, very strong to help them with their feeding. And so here's our little starfish, our echinoderm, our basic example. You can see the hydraulic system there with that little orange part. The ring pulls in the seawater, and then you have these little tubes running down the arms that go to little ampulla, which are basically like little compressors that compress the water and push them out into their little tube feet that are able to move around. So there's their little tube feet. And what they're able to do is they're able to use the power of the water and how hydraulic systems work, and they can generate a massive amount of force with those little tube feet. One little tube foot might not be very strong, but you start putting hundreds and hundreds of them together, and they can generate an enormous amount of force. They actually can generate so much force that they can go to a clam and they can pry that clam open, and they stick their stomach inside the shell and digest it up inside of its own shell and soak up the juices. Right, but they're actually so strong that they can crank open the shell of a clam and eat the clam out from the inside. That's extremely strong. If you've ever seen a clam and actually ever tried to open them up, they're extremely strong and powerful. It's a very difficult thing to do. On the outsides of all of our starfish and sea urchins and all of these guys, they have little pincher things like this that actually keep anything from growing on them. You will never see a starfish with algae or sea anemones or barnacles growing off of them. And these are all of our groups. You don't have to know every single one of them. What I do want you to know is just some of the examples. All right. So this is our crinoid, also known as a feather star. These guys trap food as it falls down. Typically, they live deep down in the ocean, and as things die, it sinks down, and these guys grab the zooplankton and things like that are falling down from above. There's our little starfish, like we said. A lot of them eat clams and other bivalves. But they can eat a whole bunch of different things. This is a special type of sea star called a crown of thorns. And these crown of thorns actually eat coral. So they'll go around eating coral, and yes, those are giant spines all over the entire back of it. And yes, those are my arms. I caught this in Hawaii. Those spines actually are very sharp spines, and at the base of those spines is a venom sac. So if you bump into the spine, it'll not only will it stab you, but it'll inject a really nasty little venom about as bad as a bumblebee sting. So it's pretty painful. As I was catching this one, I caught a spine in the thumb. My thumb swelled up about twice the size it normally is, and it was extremely painful for the rest of the day. Highly would not recommend doing it. But I wanted to get a picture of it and show people, because this is a big problem because it eats coral, and it's a big issue in the in the Great Barrier Reef, because it's devouring the coral reefs out there, and there's not a whole lot of predators. The only predator that eats it is something called a triton snail, which is a giant sea snail that people love to eat. And so we pretty much wiped out that population. So the only natural predator has been pretty much wiped out for these guys, and so they're just going crazy and eating up all the coral reefs, causing lots and lots of devastation. This is a sea urchin. You can see there's a whole bunch of different types. There's one with the tiny little spines that aren't harmful, and then there's ones with long, skinny spines like this one. And again, just like the crown of thorns, at the base of each of those spines is a venom sac. So if it stabs into you, it not only stabs into you, but it injects a venom. And these sea urchins actually are designed that spine will come off. And so it's kind of like a porcupine spine. It has little hooks at the tip of it, and then once it goes inside your skin, those hooks grab a hold, and it's not able to be pulled back out. And so the more you wriggle, the more it goes deeper inside your skin, and it injects that venom. And so not only do you get this stabbing thing inside your skin, and you get the injected venom, but you just basically have to break it off, and then it takes about a week for it to dissolve away from underneath your skin. This is known as a brittle star. They're very popular for aquariums. And this is a sea cucumber. Sea cucumbers are kind of like the earthworms of the ocean. They go around and they eat up all the sand. They digest out all the organic particles within it, and then they poop out clean sand on the other end. And so pretty much if you walked on a beach, you walked on sea cucumber poop. Same thing as if you walked on the earth and you walked on earthworm poop, pretty much, because it all travels through. They clean it all out and aerate it and all that kind of good stuff. So they're very healthy for the oceans. These guys are pretty interesting, because if you see one, you can pick it up, you can squeeze it, and it'll be like a super soaker for about 2 or 3 seconds. It'll shoot a stream of water across up to about 10 feet or so, and you can. When I go to Hawaii, I've had people. We've had like little fights with them where you can squirt water across at each other with them. If you mess with them too much, they'll do something called evisceration. Evisceration is where they spit up their intestines. And basically, it's kind of a defense mechanism for them, kind of like a lizard dropping its tail. And so if a predator was coming along and started trying to eat the sea cucumber, it would spit up its guts. The guts wriggle and writhe and move around and draw the attention of the predator away. The predator will eat those and hopefully leave the sea cucumber alone. And then later on, it can actually regrow its own intestines. Pretty crazy mechanism, but it seems to work very well for them since there's a lot of them around. and that's our group of invertebrates. So that was our introduction to animals and all of our invertebrates. Next set of notes will be on our vertebrate groups, our chordates, which will go into all the different classes within those. So please look over these guys. Make sure you pay attention to the things I told you to pay attention to, and take a look at the chart that you have to fill in. Have a good day.